Welcome to the roundtable on evil. We're so glad that you're here today. This is co-sponsored by the Department of English and the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry. Can you really hear me? Because I can't. You can?
Yeah. Okay.
I trust you. I'm your moderator. I'm Cynthia Kuhn. I'm a professor in the English department. Before we introduce the panelists, here's a little bit about DeFi. It is a citywide public humanities center, and there are upcoming events, including a live outdoor performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which we call Shakespeare in the Parking Lot, and a conversation about the role of the humanities in responding to crises such as the one that occurred in Charlottesville last summer. For more information, please check out defi.org. That's DPHI, defi.org. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. First up, Amy Eckert. Amy Eckert is a professor of political... Amy's a professor of political science. Her research focuses on the ethics of war, and her book, Outsourcing War, The Just War Tradition in the Age of Military Privatization, was published by Cornell University Press in 2016. Another recent publication is Cui Bono, Moral Victory in Privatized War. In the book, Moral Victories, The Ethics of Winning War, is now available from Oxford University Press. Please welcome Amy.
Are you going to introduce first? Yeah, that's great.
We're very professional here. Okay. Craig Svonkin is an associate English professor and executive director of the Pacific Ancient and Modern Language Association. He's published essays including Manischewitz and Saki, The Kaddish and Sutras, Allen Ginsberg's Spiritual Self-Othering, Muggles, Giants, and House Elves, Oh My, Harry Potter, Liberalism and the Problem of Evil, Melville and the Bible, Moby Dick or the Whale, Multivocalism and Plurality.
Threes are magic numbers. Everything is a three. It's
Good titles. A Southern California Boyhood in the Simu Southland Shadows of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. And If Only LA Had a Soul, Spirituality and Wonder at the Museum of Jurassic Technology. Sadly, he cannot grow a respectable beard. Adam Graves is Associate Professor of Philosophy, Director of DeFi, and Primary Advisor for the Religious Studies minor. It says, yes, we have one of those. His published work explores themes in phenomenology and the philosophical hermeneutics of religion, as well as problems associated with selfhood, agency, and responsibility. He also cannot grow a respectable beard, but, unlike his esteemed colleague, abandoned all hope of appearing respectable some time ago. Finally, we have Andrea, say it please.
Maestrejuan.
Andrea Maestrejuan is an associate professor of history after having several different careers, including forays in biotechnology and oral history. She finally settled on the less lucrative but much more esoteric field of the economic history of science and technology. Her research analyzes the markets for technology in Germany, focusing on the role of individual inventors to develop innovative technologies. Excuse me. Her teaching areas include world history, European history, and the ever-popular history of Nazi Germany. Her beard-growing proclivities are a closely guarded secret. Welcome, Andrea. After the panelists present, we will have a question and answer period, so you'll be able to ask them all of your burning questions at the end. Okay, take it away. Do you need this?
No, I think
I don't think so. I think I'm good. All right. Excellent. I mean, I think that this is a really good time for us to be looking at this concept of evil. I think it's actually really helpful to look at it from different perspectives. This is a concept that has made something of a resurgence in international relations in the not super distant past, as you can see behind me. You've got George W. Bush's Axis of Evil depicted in this political cartoon, which is kind of appropriate because he talked about it in a way that was somewhat cartoonish, right? So I want us to maybe begin to look at this concept in a way that's perhaps a little more nuanced and perhaps helpful in terms of dealing with actual evil in the world, right? It's certainly tempting, and in many ways it's comfortable to kind of fall into this way of thinking that certain individuals, certain groups, certain countries are inherently evil, especially given the atrocities that we've seen unfolding around the world. But I'm going to suggest to you today that despite the appeal of this way of thinking, it may not ultimately be a very useful or helpful approach to thinking about evil. Indeed, I think if we take a closer look, we'll see that many of the acts that we would identify as being evil actions are carried out by people who are, in fact, in many ways quite ordinary. Psychology, one of our sister social sciences, has explored this idea in a number of experiments, including the Stanford prison experiment. And in this experiment, what happened was they recruited a number of college students, perhaps not so different from many of those of you in the audience, and they randomly assigned these recruits roles in the experiment. Some of them were randomly selected to be guards, some of them were randomly selected to be prisoners. So they gave each group kind of the trappings of their role. So the guards wore guard uniforms, they carried wooden nightsticks, the prisoners wore kind of ill-fitting prison jumpsuits. They were arrested and given the mugshot, the whole treatment, and put into these cells. Within just a few days of the beginning of the experiment, about a third of the people who had been assigned to the role of guards began to exhibit behavior that was genuinely sadistic. They were depriving prisoners of mattresses so that they had to sleep on the cement floor. They were engaging in a lot of behavior towards the prisoner group that was really degrading and humiliating in a lot of ways. So they were, in essence, they were kind of coming to embody this role and embodying the worst parts of this role, even though they had essentially come from the same group as the prisoners, right? They were just happened to be randomly selected to be guards. Unfortunately, this result is also fairly consistent with what we see in real life. Few events seem more evil to us than the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. The pace of the killing, which claimed approximately 800,000 lives, outstripped the pace of killing even during the Nazi Holocaust, which I think some of my fellow panelists are going to talk about as well. Yet, most of those who did the killing were individuals who were, in most respects, very ordinary people. The Rwandan genocide was really a case of neighbors killing neighbors in a number of respects. The Hutu perpetrators were able to easily identify their Tutsi victims, in part because they'd been living side by side with these people for a number of years. There were some exceptions, we should note. In the Butare province, the population proved to be unwilling to take up arms and kill their neighbors. As a result, the government flew in militia people who unfortunately were willing to do exactly that. We also see, of course, some heroic individuals who stand out in the context of this tragedy. Paul Rusesabagina is one example. He hid more than 1,000 refugees who were fleeing the genocide, and his actions were ultimately the basis for the film Hotel Rwanda. If you've seen that. Unfortunately, though, these are really exceptions, and most people were willing to pick up machetes and maim, kill, or rape their neighbors. The sheer number of individuals who were involved in this genocide, it creates a number of difficulties, even post genocide. For one thing, it's frustrated efforts at criminal accountability. Now, even this many years after the genocide, only a handful of people really have been convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Traditional courts in Rwanda have had a little more success in terms of dealing with some of these abuses. But the reality is that many of the killers still walk free. In the words of one of the survivors of the genocide, the killers are our neighbors now. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt explored this issue decades before the Rwanda genocide. In her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt observed Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem for his role in the mass deportations of Jews to ghettos and concentration camps during World War II. And she noted that Eichmann was examined by at least 6 psychiatrists. None of them found any trace of mental illness or any kind of psychological disorder. They noted that perhaps his most unusual trait was essentially being unusually normal in terms of his habits and his proclivities. Certainly, if we're going to attach the word evil to any actions, the Nazi Holocaust is deserving, obviously, of that label. But the smaller actions within this overall campaign were, for the most part, carried out by individuals who were not discernibly different from average individuals. They carried out their individual roles for reasons that we would probably see as more ordinary than evil. Things like professional advancement or duty or conformity, which were all factors in Eichmann's actions and reasons that he offered to explain the things that he had done. So I think that what Hannah Arendt is really telling us is that evil acts aren't always carried out by people who are easily identified as evil people, right? We can't have this sort of cartoonish concept of evil that I started with and just kind of tidily label certain people, certain groups as evil. Instead, we have to accept the more difficult possibility that the most ordinary people among us have the potential to engage in evil actions, sometimes for reasons that are quite ordinary. Those of you in the audience who know me know I'm a sci-fi horror fan. The tagline from one of my favorite series, American Horror Story, puts it somewhat differently, right? That all monsters are human, you know.
Thank you, Amy. That was really, really interesting. And thank you all for coming, by the way. I just really appreciate you taking the time to be here, especially on what is a glorious afternoon in this windowless room. We do have this window, but not sure you'll like the images you have to suffer through. If telling half-truths is a form of lying, then I'm afraid I'm about to commit some sins. But nonetheless, here we go. When humans suffer, it's perfectly natural for them to ask, why me? We seek answers in the hope of avoiding future suffering, but also because understanding has itself a sort of palliative effect. I'm better off knowing that my heart disease is caused by my well-known addiction to Oreos, and it is Oreo week, I'm told, that a terrorist attack was sparked by a political conflict, a mass shooting by a mental disorder. Modern science is one expression of this desire to make sense of our world or to make the world into something intelligible to us. But in those instances where we are most apt to employ the word evil, our explanations always fall short. Evil is a name for that remainder or residue of unintelligibility. And the question about the existence of evil is a question about the intelligibility of our world. If evil exists, then our world is not fully intelligible to us. One of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment was an almost naive optimism about the intelligibility of our world, a near fanatical faith in the progress of human understanding. Here is Leibniz, the poster child of this rosy view, who advanced the so-called principle of sufficient reason, according to which every contingent truth has a cause which, at least in principle, can be known. Or simply put, that everything that happens for a reason. Combine this principle with his belief in a morally righteous deity, and you wind up with the view that this world, although seemingly imperfect, must be the best of all possible worlds. as his wig is clearly the best of all possible wigs. Apparently, apparent evil is really just an instrument of good that is a necessary means for bringing about the best of worlds. So, ironically, Leibniz's optimism about scientific progress was grounded in his faith in God's infinite perfection and moral goodness. And reconciling this God with the appearance of evil in our world, a task known since Leibniz as theodicy, was not a trivial theological squabble, but rather science itself depended on it. And then, on the morning of All Saints' Day in 1755, one of history's deadliest earthquakes struck off the coast of Portugal, completely demolishing the city of Lisbon and killing upwards of 100,000 of its inhabitants, most of whom were busy praying away at churches which collapsed upon them. The quake ruptured more than the city. It also ruptured the Enlightenment's optimism about the intelligibility of our world. In a celebrated poem about the infamous earthquake, Voltaire takes Leibniz to task. "Come, philosophers who cry, all is well, and contemplate the ruins of this world. Behold the debris and ashes of the unfortunate, the endless subject of useless pain." I'm reminded of yesterday's fire that killed, I believe, at least 2 people right here in Denver, less than a mile from where I live. How can we say that this is the best possible worlds, a best of all possible worlds when things such as that happen? Natural disasters have served as both literal and figurative reminders of senseless suffering. In the biblical Job, who I think I have an image of. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so let's see. The biblical Job, whose entire progeny were said to have perished in a similar natural disaster, never gave up faith in God, but was forced to abandon the idea that he could understand God's ways. Today, of course, we tend to think of evil as a human rather than natural phenomenon, as Amy just pointed out. Hume, who was busy writing the dialogues concerning natural religion at the time of the Lisbon earthquake, is at least partially responsible for the now widespread view that the physical universe is not evil, but rather morally neutral or indifferent. And of course, there's a great gulf between mere indifference on the one hand and genuine evil on the other. As Rousseau pointed out, how do you call people from Lisbon? Lisboans? If the Lisbonese, sorry, I intended to look that one up. If the Lisbonese experienced evil, it was the result of their own voluntary but rather imprudent choice to live in large, densely populated cities, which maximized the destructive nature of natural disasters. Today, we might say the same thing about mudslides or floods or the consequences of global climate change. To make sense of the seemingly modern view, we would have to turn back the clock yet another 1,000 years or so to a young 4th century North African pervert, later known as Saint Augustine, who spent his youth wavering between the Orthodox Christian faith of his mother and the teachings of a Gnostic by the name of Mani, the father of Manichaeanism. Augustine was puzzled by a certain fact about himself. He knew what he ought to do, but he nearly always failed to do it. His constant prayer was, "Lord, make me chaste, only not quite yet," which is what I say whenever I'm faced with those Oreo cookies. Manichaeanism offered an easy explanation for human fallibility, since it conceived of the cosmos as a battleground upon which 2 co-eternal forces struggle, the forces of good and evil. My soul, Augustine thought, is entirely good, but it's bogged down and held prisoner by my evil physical body, the source of the desires, passions, and appetites that lead me astray. Augustine, a mama's boy, if there ever was one, eventually abandoned Manichaean views in order to join his mother as an Orthodox Christian. But this meant rejecting dualism and the idea that physical nature is inherently evil. For if there's only one God, who is wholly good and who created everything ex nihilo, that is out of nothing, then the world and everything in it must be intrinsically good, including my physical body. If bodily desires or appetites were the cause of my evil deeds, then God would be responsible for them, since, after all, he created my body. Augustine tells a famous but seemingly trivial story about his childhood, where he climbed a fence and broke onto some private land, stole some pears, only to later throw them at a bunch of swine. What do you call a group of swine? A herd? A herd of swine. He asked himself, why'd I do it? Not out of appetite or desire for, he wasn't hungry for pears. The pears didn't taste good. They didn't even look beautiful. And besides, he just threw them away. His answer, of course, was meant to supply or at least address a concern about another theft which took place under another tree. How could beings living in paradise, whose bodies and souls are in a perfect harmonious relationship, fall from a state of innocence into a state of guilt? Again, no bodily explanation can be given. All that can be said is that sin itself, perhaps evil itself, appears on the scene as an inexplicable act of transgression for the mere sake of transgression. So in the end, it's not just that the world is unintelligible, but perhaps we are unintelligible ourselves. And of course, there's a lot more to say about this, but I'm going to pass the mic.
So I'm calling this talk The Appeals and Problematics of Evil. Evil is a problem. How to understand it, how to define it. Charles Matthews provisionally defines evil as something that's not just against the moral order, something that's not just wrong, however you construe the moral order, but intentionally and willfully against that order. In this way, he seems to be very Augustinian, I think. Matthews, a historian of religious concepts of evil, however, doesn't offer us a definition that is, in my opinion, useful here. Perhaps because a definition that will work for everyone, or even most people, is impossible, especially in our post-theist, post-Shoah, the Hebrew word for the Holocaust, world. Plus, how useful is a definition for evil that depends on another unclear concept, like the moral order? Do we, in fact, share a common definition of the moral order or of evil? Some might argue that while they cannot define evil, they know it when they see it. But this definition will not help us very much. The many evil quizzes to be found online might, such as the 9-question "How evil are you?" quiz, where this is from, by Mental Field. But when you look at these quizzes, there's a lot of them online. They further indicate some of the problematics of defining evil. If you were a predator, would you attack your prey directly or hide and wait for the right time? Do you often lie? Have you ever killed an ant? If someone bullies you, will you never forget, let it go, or get revenge? We probably couldn't agree as a community here, a little community here, on the ethical values implied by some of these questions, let alone on whether not forgiving someone who has not repented is evil or just common sense, or on whether a person who kills the person who they are certain had killed their child is misguided, in trauma, a hero, or evil. And these are just 2 examples. I think if we take almost any situational example of something that some people consider evil in this room, we'd find others to disagree. So, the metaphor matters. So if evil is a difficult or impossible thing to define, why should we bother with evil as a concept at all? Because evil, despite its many problematics, remains, if used carefully, a useful psychological or narratological, expressive or coping tool. When we are being oppressed or see others being harmed or oppressed, it can be emotionally and perhaps morally useful to use the hyperbolic evil epithet rather than wrong-headed or unkind. Additionally, the concept of evil demands study in that it continues to have a profound impact on decisions we make, on the literature, films, and media we consume, the politics we practice. As cognitive linguist George Lakoff explains, the conceptual metaphors of evil we use influence the way we think, communicate, and act. A brief example. The Christian concept of original sin leads to one kind of worldview. And in contrast, we're not quite there yet, and in contrast, the rabbinic idea of evil tends to lead to other types of ideologies and moral practices. Jews traditionally refer to humans as having 2 impulses. This is the Yetzer Hara, or the inclination to do bad, and the Yetzer Tov, the inclination to do good. In Bereshit Rabbah 9:7, which is a midrash, Rabbi Nachman said, without the Yetzer Hara, the inclination to do bad, no man would build a house, take a wife, and beget children. And thus said Solomon, again I considered all labor and all excelling in work, that is a man's rivalry with his neighbor. So in other words, the Jewish idea is that inclination to do bad, like the inclination, the urge to be competitive with your neighbor, actually in balance can have a positive effect. It is only when left unchecked that human instincts for the Jewish traditional Jews, like lust, anger, or envy, are considered evil or potentially evil or sinful. Evil for the rabbinic Jewish writers is largely defined by the impact on the external world that human thoughts, impulses, and mostly actions have, whereas for most traditional thinkers after Augustine, a person is evil when he or she rebels against God's order, even in mind, not action, and even when such rebellion causes no external visible harm to others. So now we go to Nietzsche. So given this problem of evil meaning such dramatically different things to people from different cultures, and giving Nietzsche's assertion that good and evil are entirely socially constructed concepts, what use does this term still hold? For Nietzsche, being evil is resisting tradition, however reasonable or stupid tradition may be. And we are thus wise to move beyond our faith in moral traditions, especially Jewish and Christian traditions, which Nietzsche views as largely, in his his attempt to aestheticize these questions, largely ascetic, unnatural, unhealthy, and unreasonable. But this doesn't mean Nietzsche isn't interested in studying the history of these changing ideas and concepts of evil. And I think we should follow Nietzsche in that path as well. Despite his loss of faith in God, we, following Nietzsche, can and should still discuss the power of concepts of evil to form and affect us. So perhaps Wittgenstein, here we go, Wittgenstein, can help us in this post-Freudian, this post-Nietzschean, post-Humean, post-Shoah world. Wittgenstein argues that the loose concept of games might work not via a clear definition of games, which he says does not exist, and not through one generic trait, but rather through family resemblances. He says you can't define something like games, but there are family resemblances. And these have a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing. So we can try this idea of family resemblances to see if evil is one of those things that we can see that shares certain similarities. However, I would argue that this is a dead end. I've tried it myself with my friends. I've said, what does infidelity, lying, stealing, harming others have in common? And these don't seem to cohere into one concept. These seem to be, there doesn't seem to me to be an umbrella concept of evil that will hold these very different values or ideals together. So what I might list as evil is simply a messy laundry list that will not cohere. So if evil no longer holds as a coherent intellectual concept, does it serve any purpose? Why think about evil at all? Why not say these other terms like selfishness or greed? Because, as George Lakoff points out, the conceptual metaphors of evil form our worldview. We can go to the next slide. And if we look at literature, art, film, and propaganda, we can see varied and influential metaphors of evil at work, working on us. For example, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde reveals, I think, a few different metaphors of evil at work. Evil in Jekyll seems a form of psychological unbalance, caused by repression, perhaps, a la Sigmund Freud, although he's writing, concurrently or even a little bit earlier than Freud. Or evil here might also be akin to a drug or alcohol addiction, an addiction that unleashes the id, or perhaps evil is an internal human tendency common to us all. All of these metaphors, I think, overlap often when we talk about evil. So has evil thus become a fictional concept or a linguistic concept entirely separate from life? A concept that, if we go to the next slide, that is found more in language or metaphor than in history? Yes and no. Genocide remains one, I would agree with Amy, of the final events or actions that most of us can still agree to be evil. And as adultery, vanity, and dishonesty, gluttony have fallen out, genocide seems to hold on to that one last spot that we all would probably agree is an evil action. Even those who generally prefer to use psychologically inflected terms like bystander apathy, sociopathy, narcissism, ideologue, and sadism to the religiously or mythically inflected term evil, often retain the use of the term evil for genocides like the Holocaust, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge. And so we should not be surprised to find that many of our contemporary depictions and discussions of evil in film, literature, and popular culture continue to allude to those considered to be sociopathic monsters, primarily Hitler and his cohorts. But Hitler is not the only model for contemporary artistic depictions of evil. Fears of metaphysical evil, of Satan, stick around as remnants, as phantoms of largely rejected but persistently metaphysical Christian beliefs from an earlier era. So we can see in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in his depiction of the satanic Sauron, an atavistic phantom of a bygone Christian belief in metaphysical or mythic evil. Psychologist Henry Murray argues that we are left with a Satan today who is no more than a vestigial image, a broken spirited relic of a perished past, which is possible. But perhaps vestigial fictional allusions to Satan, from Sauron to Voldemort to Hannibal Lecter, indicate a cultural desire for markers of metaphysical ultimate evil. Perhaps they express what Andrew Delbanco says is his frustration that with our loss of faith in the fall and Satan, we now are more likely to diagnose Hitler and Stalin, figuring whether are they narcissists or sociopaths, rather than to call them evil. Delbanco mourns the moral sledgehammer that has been lost with the erosion of the epithet and the concept of evil. Perhaps Tolkien, J.K. Rowling, and other fantasy writers do as well. So if we go to Tolkien's, we go to something else from Tolkien. Tolkien doesn't only use this kind of conservative concept of evil, however. We see a more complex and conflicted idea of evil. His depiction of Sauron reflects a conservative Christian view of evil as metaphysical and outside the self, as inhering in another. He also uses the conservative idea of the evil as an ethnic other. The orcs are dark-skinned, right? And the hobbits are surrogate, good, light-skinned, quasi-Englishmen. But Tolkien also offers another kind of concept of evil that's a more liberal concept, maybe a post-Freudian concept, of evil as psychic neurosis. The internal struggle of Frodo, and this is, go back one, that's Smeagol before his infection by the external evil of the ring. And Frodo also has this problem. Here's Gollum afterwards. So the internal struggle of Frodo over whether to follow Eros or Thanatos, to use Freud, and the struggle of the two Gollums, the psychically split, neurotic Gollum Smeagol, arguing with himself over whether to help or harm his friend Frodo. These seem much more impacted by Marx or by Freud, by modern ideas of evil as either, or Rousseau perhaps, of external influences on the self or as internal psychic problems. J.K. Rowling in her Harry Potter books likewise demonstrates conflicting ideas of evil, an external metaphysical and a liberal quasi-Freudian concept of evil as internal. But she seems to eventually come down on the side of the conservative idea of evil. While she offers some cultural and familial reasons for her character's evil behavior, even trying to trace the psychological sources of Voldemort's evil, ultimately she, like Tolkien, moves into this more conservative idea of evil. Voldemort ultimately remains a figure of pure, irredeemable evil. Perhaps the good evil binary found in most fairy tales is just too appealing to Tolkien and Rowling. Whatever the case, Rowling flirts with the liberal idea of evil as simply a function of trauma or as a result of cultural and interpersonal misunderstandings, only to reject the pluralism of liberal evil with little e for the moral clarity of the conservative concept of evil. So, to kind of get to the end of my argument, evident in the filmic visualization of Voldemort, if you go back one, you see, evident in this is an echo of European anti-Semitic art. So let's go to the next slide, thank you. If you look especially at the figure of the Jew, these are Jewish doctors. The one on the top right looks very much like a kind of prefiguration of Voldemort. We can see in this grotesque Voldemort-esque image of a Jew from Albrecht Dürer's 1506 painting, Christ Among the Doctors, the dangers of depicting an enemy as evil. Certainly, depicting enemies as evil can help to unite a community or nation in wartime, as we can see from American World War II propaganda art, or can help the powerless to cope with the bullies and autocrats who abuse and control them. You know, I've had times where I've liked to think of my enemies, my opponents as evil, even in good old lovely Metro, where we're all friends and family. So it can help the powerless or the less powerful to deal with those issues. It can also stereotype and thus grease the wheels for oppression or genocide. So if we look at these are anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda, such as these works. You could just go through them, we don't have to look at them too long, which demonstrate the dangers of using metaphors of evil, these conservative metaphors. But with these dangers comes an important need to analyze how the metaphors of evil retain such power in our society, how these metaphors inform and form us, and whether we are liberal or conservative or something else in the metaphors we use. Finally, this is a painting called The Banality of Evil by Banksy, where he took a actual terrible painting and he painted Hitler looking at the lovely nature scene. Depictions of evil might lead to catastrophic harm, demonizing, stereotyping, and othering people in order to help to justify their oppression. Another potential drawback to depictions of evil, a drawback that we can see in this Banksy poem, is the turning of evil banal, the cheapening, undermining, and erosion of our horrors at evil, like slavery and the Shoah. But despite this danger, I believe we still must study the metaphors of evil that surround and influence us, despite their constructedness. And despite the dangers involved, some rhetorical or narratological uses of evil remain psychologically or morally useful, if no longer theoretically coherent. For while narratives of understanding across cultural differences are essential, some people lacking power desire the rhetorical power and psychological salve that labeling a Donald Trump or a cruel sadistic boss as evil provides, as problematic as this labeling might be, should the goal be avoidance of conflict. Thank you.
Okay, so when I was asked to be on this panel, I kind of assumed why I was being asked, because I'm a historian that teaches the history of Nazi Germany, and if we can probably all agree on concepts of evil, this is probably one area of history that was certainly the human incarnation of evil. But then I had to kind of prepare something to say about that, and I struggled with this, so I was bombarding my colleagues. And so as I was trying to come up with something profound about the history of evil, a colleague reminded me that evil spelled backwards is life. That was no help whatsoever. So how do historians grapple with the concept of evil or the concept of good? And the short answer is we don't. That doesn't mean to say that I don't deal with issues of evil and good in my teaching. I teach obviously the history of Nazi Germany. I've spoken to groups about the Holocaust. I teach World War I and discuss the Armenian genocide. I teach Russian history and talk about the purges and collectivization. I've even taught a 20th century world history course doing nothing but teaching the history of genocides in the 20th century. So you would think I would be able to come up with something a little bit more articulate, and I hope I can convey some ways in which historians deal with the topic of evil. Even in my research, and this gets to Arendt's kind of idea of the banality of evil, when I had to kind of deal with this in my own research, I don't actually look at the Third Reich directly, but it comes up in my work. And in one case, I was working in a company archive, a small business archive in Stuttgart that makes clothing. And the clothing business, or the name, came from a 19th century German biologist who had some kind of a unique ideas about the relationship between disease and clothing that I will spare you the boring details. But as I was working in this company archive, they wanted to show me they had a little kind of history of the clothing that they made. And so throughout the late 19th century and into the 20th century, it still exists as a clothing store. They took out so I got to see the age of clothing in Germany, from the corsets and things like that. And I get to the 1930s, and here they pull out a little sheepishly a brown shirt with an SA and an SS on a black one with an SS. And they kind of just said, well, we did make clothing for the SS and the SA. They needed clothing to wear when they did all their physical exercises, their military training, and we made them for them. But we didn't want to hide these from you. We did, we wanted to be honest about it. And it was the first time I realized that my own work, you can't escape, if you do German history, you really can't escape the issue of evil or goodness and evil in the kinds of research that historians do. Perhaps it's exceptional to German historians. But I don't really think so, because some of the comments I can say today, we can discuss the Armenian genocide. With some of these same ideas, which we're celebrating, commemorating, I think would be the better term, the 100th anniversary of World War I, and the Armenian genocide was a product of. We could also talk about the My Lai massacres, which occurred 50 years ago this month by American troops in Vietnam. So we deal with these in our teaching and in our work, but sometimes we just aren't as conscious about them, how concepts of evil and good work. So if I were to put a title to my talk, it would be The Contingent Nature of Morality and the Problem of Intent. And historians don't avoid moral judgments like good and evil, but we have to rephrase the question to answer what our sources tell us about historical agents and historical agency. And the issue of free will may come up, but I have to leave that to the philosophers. So I'll begin with a quote from somebody who took a very a small town approach to trying to understand the rise of Nazism and how ordinary Germans, as Amy, or ordinary people, as Amy was mentioning and discussing, became Nazis. And at the end of this work, he says, the problem of Nazism, and we could put in here anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, was primarily a problem of perception. In this respect, Nordheim's difficulties, this is the town he studied, and just one town in a very large nation, and Nordheim's fate are likely to be shared by other humans in other towns under similar circumstances. So the contingent nature of understanding concepts of evil have to be seen in light that as humans we share certain characteristics, but at the same time that context and in this very Nietzschean way, culture are constructed by historical circumstances. So I'm going to invoke, because as a historian of Nazi Germany, the ghost of Hannah Arendt. Her concepts of evil resonate in most work that historians of Germany read. And I'm going to go a little bit further back than the Eichmann trial, where she coins this very famous term, the banality of evil, to discuss just briefly this concept of totalitarianism that she embraced, and Kant's idea of radical evil. For her, this evil evil became conceptualized in this very unique set of circumstances in which she painted the atrocities of Hitlerism and Nazism with the atrocities of Stalinism, to argue that only in this kind of configuration of ideologues, strongmen, and masses, sheepish masses, one might argue, can this radical notion of evil, this and total evil, be constructed. There's a lot of problems with her theories of totalitarianism, and one that it makes it because it homogenizes a lot of different experiences, and there is a political agenda behind it as well. But she gave historians targets to go after. And it became very easy then to look at evil as a kind of an individualized experience. It made it very easy to focus on individuals, super individuals, if you will, with incredible historical agency or human agency, like Hitler and Stalin, and the masses then becoming these agentless victims to a abstract notion of the state or a charismatic leader. And she wanted to pursue this more because at the Nuremberg trials, so 6 million Jews are exterminated, and Nuremberg trials, 22 at the military tribunal trial, 22 defendants were put on trial. 22 defendants to place the blame on 6 million Jewish deaths, 25 to 30 million deaths in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The numbers only go from there. And most of those defendants are not found guilty, or punished with short imprisonment. Some are released early. Very few actually were executed for the crimes. So it defies logic, or it, kind of defies sense that 22 individuals could be held accountable for all the crimes committed against humanity during World War II. With the Eichmann trials, she then changes her idea from this radical notion of evil, this very individualized, almost character-driven ideas about evil, to coin the term of the banality of evil. My slides. So the first slide was the Nuremberg trials. The Eichmann, stood, as many of the Nuremberg trial defendants did, as an ordinary person. He made his defense based on he was following duty. He was conscientiously doing his job. Virtues that certainly were resonant within at least modern Western culture. And so how do you explain the idea of a person acting virtuously and yet committing atrocities or committing evil? She coins the banality of evil to say, well, at some point the bureaucracy, this anonymous, depersonalized bureaucracy, is responsible. And for historians, this makes no sense either. Where, again, the majority of human beings, just in the case of totalitarianism, become victims. They lose their human agency. They are no longer historical actors and making choices, having to make difficult, clearly moral choices. But history isn't simply about the history of historical agents who have more agency and historical agents who have no agency. This concept of bystander is ever present in these discussions, and you had mentioned, Craig had mentioned bystanders, but the reality is most people were part of the Nazi system, the Nazi regime. They were living and acting and making decisions on a daily basis, and so how do we explain the agency of these people? Maybe not to pull the trigger or to insert the gas into the chamber, but as people who chose not to act on their historical agency. Briefly, I'll talk about a work that has brought a lot of historians to look at the actions of ordinary people, because that's what historians do. And in Christopher Browning's work, Ordinary Men, he traces the lives of a battalion of men who were very ordinary. They were so ordinary they didn't qualify for regular army. And he traces the story of how these men with no military experience from a town, Hamburg, that voted for the Nazis in the lowest proportion of the total population in Germany. How did they become professional killers? over a very short period of time before the systematic extermination of Jews in the death camps. These were moving groups that worked alongside Einsatz's commandos, led by SS officers, but with their junior officers, their most immediate superiors were ordinary men like that, themselves. And so he through a systematic process, he reveals the story of how these men who were initially exposed and were allowed to not participate in local actions against populations, increasingly after desensitization, through peer pressure, even through their leaders providing alcohol to make it easier to shoot local Jews they came across, that over a period of time they became professional killers. And so this provides a more nuanced understanding of the role of historical agents and historical agencies. So I'm gonna sum it up very quickly here. Is historians must drown in contingency. We have to see life as it really is, not as a system that creates, kind of depersonalized bureaucracies, or people who are sheepishly led down the path towards evil. And it discounts the role that good people did play, that sometimes it's atrocities happen not because it's a moral slide, but it's a moral ladder in which little good steps sometimes become account for a few acts that reaffirm our faith in the goodness of human beings. But for historians, it's not simple binaries like good and evil or free will or victimization. It's about character, it's about contingency, and it's about complexity. It's about humanity, and there is no hard wall of morality that we can turn to. So in summing up, I will just say from this book by Browning, one reason why he was motivated to do this, to write this book, was to say the policemen in the battalion who carried out the massacres and deportations, like the much smaller number who refused or evaded, were human beings. I must recognize in the same situation, I could have been either a killer or an evader. Both were human. I want to understand and explain the behavior of both.
So perhaps, how should we organize the Q&A?
We can ask each other questions, or if somebody has an urgent question, I guess.
Yeah. I think we're gonna have lots of audience.
Yeah, why don't we do that? That's a good idea. If people have questions, just shout them out, or do we have?
Yeah, I have an urgent question.
Yes. How do you get a seat up front? You just come down, Robert.
We have that mic too.
So I sincerely want to ask every one of you whether you have any faith in reason.
I would say yes, but I don't necessarily have faith that reason alone can save us. I think it's very possible that we have, in some cases, individuals doing things that seem reasonable to them that lead in the aggregate to unreasonable results, right? Like Andrea and I were both talking about the Eichmann trial, right? And Eichmann was doing things that were on some level reasonable to him, right? He was trying to kind of do his job diligently. He was seeking favor with his superiors. He was trying to get promoted. These are all reasonable things to do. They're probably things that you want me to do as my department chair. But you know, in the aggregate, you know, this individual doing things that are reasonable leads to a result that's absolutely horrifying. So I would say, yes, I have faith in reason, but I don't think reason alone is enough to get us to a good result.
Yeah, so if what you were implying by that is like kind of Plato's idea, right? That if we just know the moral, if we understood it rationally, we would do the moral, right? I assume that's my reading of Socrates, at least, or Plato. And it seems like that's sort of Kant's idea too, that you know, there's something, I mean, when he talks about the radical evil, that it's strange that you would know what's right to do and yet you would do the opposite. And I don't believe either of those at all. I think people are much more, I think while Freud gets so many details wrong and so many of his interpretations are wrong, I think his fundamental idea that we have conflicted desires and conflicted feelings and ideologies all just bombarding our brains. So yeah, we have an ability to do reasonable things, but we can get confused very easily. I mean, this is, I guess, Arendt's reading of Eichmann, that his idealization of doing one's duty leads him astray in a culture where everything has gone wrong. Where doing one's duty is now doing something that we outside of that culture would consider evil. But so I guess I don't know if I answered the question, but I don't really believe in that evil can lead you to moral reason can't lead you to moral behavior necessarily, I don't think.
I have to pass. The question is just far too loaded, Robert. I'm sorry. But I mean, I think one question that I had for my colleagues that might be a version of that question is, what are the limits of historical or the kind of interpretation that occurs within the science, within the political science or social sciences generally? What are the limits of trying to explain or account for human action on the assumption that humans are rational agents, right? Because one of the things that one kind of imperative I think that many of us, especially those of us who regard themselves as being kind of politically liberal, work on is that we ought to suspend the kind of moral judgment, the quick judgment to evil when looking at certain kinds of events. I mean, I'm thinking about the people who flew the planes into the World Trade Center. Instead of saying, you know, there's evil in the world, which is something that both liberals and conservatives you know, trying to get a broader historical, sociological, political understanding of what might have encouraged someone to take such a radical course of action. And so on the one hand, of course, I think people who are the victims of violence deserve deserve our collective recognition of the evil sources of their suffering. But on the other hand, I think there's this imperative to try to bracket that question and try to understand people on the assumption that they are acting on certain motives that are at least comprehensible to us. So do I have faith in reason? I'm not sure, but I think I'd like to believe that we can gain some understanding of our world and of actions that we don't necessarily agree with by working on the supposition that others act on reasons that are comprehensible to us.
I'm probably gonna shirk my duties here, but so we're kind of still living in this binary world of evil versus good, reason versus unreason, rational versus irrational, and it's, you know, or even and there's kind of hints in what your question about relativism and absolutism. And certainly, you know, the banality of evil, this idea that, you know, you can justify any claim that one virtue to be upholding your duty and protecting your family are virtues that people can agree are good things, at the same time of executing millions of people are being, in the process, or part of the process that does that, is a relative. You can slip into that relativism, and certainly Arendt was accused of doing so. Do people possess reason? Yes. Do I think humans possess reason? Yes, but they, on the opposite end of that spectrum, they don't. Can we say, child sacrifice in ancient religions is evil? It's wrong. We know that. But in their context, they thought if they didn't sacrifice children, that the whole community would pay a price. That makes reasonable sense when you explain it like that. But on the other hand, and it's coming out my mouth, I'm like going, oh, yikes, right? I can't believe I'm saying that. But this is where it's messy, right? We're dealing with human beings and it gets messy and there aren't any absolutes and there's sure as heck not any binaries.
There are some mornings where I have 2 children actually that you can sacrifice.
Okay.
Coming over with the microphone. So
We
you
have
can
2
have
philosophers, so let's be careful here.
So, I had a different question, but to start out, I think there might be a distinction between people having reasons, saying the Aztecs are sacrificing people because they believe that the gods have, that they owe the gods something and that their crops won't grow. That's not the same thing as reason from the Enlightenment perspective.
Right, absolutely.
And I think from the Enlightenment perspective, it would actually reject a concept of evil which is of an immutable essential property of persons or peoples and cultures. And it's actually the genocide people who have that concept of evil. But do people really have that concept? Did Bush really think that Iraqis were irredeemable? No, he thought that they would welcome us and that they would become a Jeffersonian democracy. You look at North Korea, North and South, same culture, same people, its political regime. Even invasion of Germany, it was not to exterminate the Germans because they were irremediably evil, but because there was immutable. Who has this concept that that you're all denying?
I think some people have it. I think we forget we were in a bubble of liberalism. But if you go to some mega churches where they're talking about evildoers and Satan and an original sin and the fall, if you go to, that's the amazing thing about living in our era is we're living in not just the Enlightenment era, post-Enlightenment era, postmodern era, but we're also living in, an era of Puritanism and Calvinism. Every belief's here. So I guess that's my small caveat, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. Although I think to some extent, certainly we didn't see the entire Iraqi people as irredeemable, or all of Germany as irredeemable following World War II. But to some extent, we certainly had the belief that the regime was irredeemable, right? That we had to have regime change, we had to purge, the Nazis after World War II, the Ba'ath Party in the case of Iraq. Michael Walzer makes a distinction between criminal acts of a regime and acts of a criminal regime, right? And I think in both of those cases, at least, we definitely saw the regimes as being criminal, and even though we didn't see the population to the last person as being evil or irredeemable, we certainly killed the regime, if you will, right?
Do you want to pass the mic? Yeah, just that's okay.
No.
Oh, Adam, I was going to say, I think the 2 things you said are at cross purposes with each other. First,
deliberately for sure.
the first thing you said, okay, evil is, the recognition of evil is the recognition of the limits of intelligibility. Sense stops being made. I don't know why I had to say that nasty thing to my wife this morning. I just did, and I knew it wasn't going to be good when I said it, but I said it anyway just because of what. That's the first thing, and then the second thing, you seem to be arguing for perhaps complete intelligibility, denial of evil.
Yeah.
If only we knew everything.
Yeah, I wasn't
We would
arguing.
realize
I wasn't
there was
arguing
no
for
such-
either of those views per se, but I was presenting them as two alternatives, effectively.
Right, they're the two great
Yeah, they are the two great alternatives, right?
Okay.
And if you and I think what I was trying to say about at least some, you couldn't say this about all Enlightenment figures, but about some of the poster children of the Enlightenment, is that the belief in the intelligibility of the world was grounded, at least in part, in some really quaint belief about the existence of a benevolent, all-powerful creator God. That those two things kind of went hand in hand with someone like Leibniz. I think maybe where you're finding the tension is that it's in Augustine's adoption of this view of creation ex nihilo, this view that there is one God as opposed to two co-eternal forces that are at odds with it, that he winds up not concluding that the world is intelligible, but that his own inner life is unintelligible. And that's a peculiarity of Augustine's thought that would have required a greater attention to detail for me to explore. Obviously, it would have taken me down the path of a theory of privation theory of evil, which is the view that you well know, but maybe others don't, that evil isn't something that exists in the world, but rather evil is a lack. It's not the presence of something, but it's actually the absence of something that ought to be there. Like the fact that my phone on campus ought to be able to connect to the internet, but it can't. That's evil, I know. But it's not the presence of something, but it's the absence, and we call that a defect. So that evil is ultimately a defect, and that defect isn't therefore attributable to the stuff that the world is of. But yeah, that just takes us down a different path. It opens up a whole more cans of more worms. So yeah,
It's an interesting question, because that is now seems to be the dominant Catholic position, right? That that there is no hell. It's just the absence of God, right? You're just away from God. But I don't find it at all meeting up with social science kind of ideas of to help explain why. People who, like the Milgram experiment kind of question, that doesn't seem to be about lack, it seems to be about social forces. So I'm curious if anybody, you would know more than I do, does anybody try to, or anybody else, to reconcile these two, like the questions of social science that we allow horrible things to happen because we're social animals and we're highly influenced by others or by groups or by authority figures, and we're also trained to do so through sitting in straight rows in classrooms and being told to sit still. It's all about training duty and obedience. And that's the last, I used evil for that. That's the last thing I use it for, is that kind of ability of human beings to go along with or even cooperate with horrible actions that they know are damaging. It's hard for me, I'll use evil for somebody who is just annoying me constantly or harming me, but I realize that I'm just being hyperbolic or metaphorical. But the other just seems to rise up. But then when I look at the social science side, it doesn't make any, evil still doesn't make sense. I don't know, I don't have a question there, I'm just blathering, sorry.
Oh, I guess I have this.
You have the microphone.
it's on.
It's on, okay. Number one, for years, actually I shouldn't say, at my point in life, for decades, not years, for decades I've told myself I should teach a course on evil, on political scientists. Listening to this, I want to thank all the panelists, because I kind of kicked myself for not doing it, but at the same time, listening to all of this, I was very smart not to. Because I confuse students enough with, on the one hand, but on the other. I do enough of that as it is. But let me just add a couple of quick points. It just so happens, good time, final time, it's midterm time, so I always look for excuses not to read exams or papers. So I reread old books, and I just recently reread Ernest Becker's The Structure of Evil. He was very famous for his book about death, Ernest Becker. I think it originally came out in 1968. And there are two things I think that are very relevant to this. Starting off with what Robert asked, I happened to just jot it down because I just reread the book. because it's been a long time. And he has this idea in a very deep, kind of dense book, to say the very least, about psychology and sociology and all of that kind of stuff. But he really says that the culmination of our failure to follow the key lesson of the Enlightenment, which he simply says is critical reason. The failure to follow that has prepared, since we failed to follow that, we should be prepared, and this is his words actually, to suffer the evils which could have been prevented. I think in a lot of cases that's absolutely true. I can apply a certain amount of reason to things. You know, it's famous, John Kennedy always said after reading The Guns of August before the Cuban Missile Crisis, an important read. The thing he wanted to always avoid was a part of the book in which at the end of the war, people from Germany and the Allies say, so what started this? And the answer was, if only we knew. That's a terrible answer to give to all of that carnage. And I think critical reason does have a role. But at the same time, this is the, I think that came out so well in the panel, it's kind of a mixed bag, because the big thing in economics is behavioral economics, which is telling us we are not rational people. We are predictably irrational. It's predictable what we do, but it's irrational from a purely rational point of view. So we have
Historians been saying that for a long time. Eckert didn't invent that.
Yeah. Well, I know, but there are all these great, they write great books,
Yeah.
behavioral economists. And anyway, so with all, I don't want to carry on, but with all of that, there's another thing from that book that just struck me with what was just said. The preface to the book has a couple of quotes, and one of them is from Thomas Carlyle. I teach leadership stuff primarily now. Carlyle comes up all the time. It's all about agency or social forces. I'm a political scientist who actually believes in agency, Nelson Mandela. But at the same time, we talk about that. And Carlyle put it this way, this is the quote at the beginning of this book. He said, essentially, people are surrounded by a glass bell that conditions what they're going to do. You can only act within certain parameters. But at the end, he also says, right? But the bell is made out of glass. Therefore, essentially the bold, if I sound Machiavellian here, can break the glass and shatter it to pieces, and then as he put it, and then, we're delivered. So that's the kind of the combination that we always get to all the time, and I think this panel highlighted a lot of those things very much. But just to add, there are a lot of neurological studies which can be overblown but still tell us a lot of stuff. Baby studies, for example, tend to show us that children come with an innate sense, just before they've been really socialized, of right and wrong. If you want to say good and evil in line with it. When they've showed studies of a puppet that interferes with someone walking upstairs and does all these things, and one who helps someone up the stairs, almost inevitably they pick the one who has helped, is the puppet that they want. So I mean, we have all of those kind of things, and we do have this other thing, it's about human nature. One of the things that we haven't really talked about is this great book called The Allure of Toxic Leaders, Jean Lippman Blumen, great book. And part of the thing that's so great about it is she says, it is, we always like to blame leaders for everything, but part of it is what we want as people. So one of the things toxic leaders, evil leaders, whatever label, provide us is with some things that we want. Safety, security, making us feel special. Those themes come up all the time because that's what people desire. And so I think part of it, and that's why obedience to authority, Stanley Milgram's thing, and the Philip Zimbardo study mentioned about Stanford. And it's interesting, Zimbardo's much more recent book is called The Lucifer Effect. So it shows you we even go back to Lucifer and all that kind of stuff. But just thank you for I got a million things.
Would you share the mic? Would you just pass? Maybe we can just pass it along there.
If anyone had anything to say.
Yeah, somebody should comment.
Well, I'll say this, the idea that we are prone to want good, I think is true, but I think Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story called The Imp of the Perverse. He's influenced by Leibniz in a lot of weird ways, and Eureka. And I think Poe's right too. There's also that counter desire. There's something really aesthetically pleasing about seeing somebody hit in the face or falling downstairs. We know this is true. If you take a 2-year-old and you put up your hand and then you let them give you a high five, and then you go like this and kiss your hand, like pretend like you're in pain, they will laugh. And that is a universally good game to play, and they'll want to do it again and again. So not only do they want the order or whatever, they have empathy, some of them. I also think human beings are a continuum that we always forget. Some of us are more empathetic than others. This could be cultural, but it could also be somewhat, there's outliers in every kind of, when you look at gender, where, the bell curve works in all kinds of ways, not the one way that has been used very well, but it works in all kinds of ways. And I think maybe also in like our degree of sociopathy versus empathy might be, plus people like me, I was a sociopath all through my childhood. I'm trying to unlearn it.
It goes with the territory.
Yeah, perhaps so.
But they know you're playing a game.
They do, that's true.
That's a difference, a key
Yeah,
difference.
maybe you're right.
So everybody seems to agree that this word is inadequate. It's too simplistic or pre-modern or something common that we all could fall victim to, and nevertheless, Craig says it's still a useful term.
Yeah,
And I just want to question that. I think I'm never going to use that term again in my life. It's lost its usefulness, hasn't it? Or isn't that what you're really all saying?
Depends what you want to do with it. If you're trying to wage war, it's a very useful term. I mean, this is one of the things I would say is that, I don't know, Craig, if you had suggested earlier that you think that the privation theory of evil is popular today. I actually think quite the opposite. I think that political discourse, it's almost a prerequisite to becoming president of the United States. You have to believe in the substantive existence of the world. There's something out there that needs to be fought
You have to have an
against.
evildoer.
or an evil axis.
Yeah,
And that we're good, and also the binary of good and evil is just, you can't say, God bless America, but I wish it were a bit better if you're running for president. I mean, that would be a phrase that would end your presidential run. So I think you may be right, maybe I over.
Nixon's chief of staff famously blamed the 18-minute gap on the tape on sinister forces or evil instead of on Nixon.
And the Lucifer effect.
So rhetorically it's useful, sure, politically useful, but that doesn't mean it's useful in our discourse.
Yeah, that was a bit tongue-in-cheek.
It's a word I think we should avoid it.
I guess my defense of it was twofold, just to clarify it. One is that people still believe it in different ways. Like, I really like that George Lakoff book about morals, where he says that, we have to figure out what the conceptual metaphors are at work. And he says that conservatives, when they talk about morality, are often talking about like an idea of a strong father morality. And the liberals are a nurturing father or parent morality. And then he thinks that works all the way through. And he's very convincing that this works all the way through the metaphors that form the way we think. So I think we have to look at it. Now, whether we use it in our private lives or not is different. I'm just thinking that it depends, just like the joke. I think a cruel joke aimed at a person in power from somebody who's powerless has value. Right? I think it has value. I think we see it in our culture. It's a way of coping. It's a way of trying to satirize or mock. On the other hand, a cruel joke from somebody in power against the weak, I think, is morally reprehensible. And so I would say the same thing with the linguistic use of the term evil. And also, you gotta know when to use it. You don't use it at your department meeting, but in your own private life, why not? Or why can't I say Trump is evil? He's bringing, I guess people also differentiate between evil actions. They're more comfortable with saying that action was evil, but then when we say that person is evil, we get really uncomfortable. Maybe because it assumes an essentialism, which I think that's a valid critique.
And I think the word evil is still something that we tend to use when consoling the victims of certain kinds of atrocities.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not sure if this is the case, but one might imagine we have a responsibility, kind of a moral responsibility to accept that. I'm not really sure. I'm curious what groups of Holocaust survivors, would say about this, or, whether or not. For example, if a historian approached a group of survivors of something like the Holocaust and said, yeah, well, I think we could actually explain, Hitler, his parents did this, and, he was raised in this particular fashion, and, well, the weather was really bad. He ate these things. And Siri has some views on this subject. I wonder if...
he was looking at me and I was getting nervous, so I was supposed to and yes, that's an Australian male Siri voice.
We all have our idiosyncrasies.
Well, and they don't talk. It's this issue of not so much in terms of evil, although the language using the term evil doesn't come up as more as this transformation, where we were neighbors one day and not the next day, but that it's more couched in terms of being humans and members of the community, and then becoming dehumanized through this process and becoming non-human, and that space that's created, for them, allowed them to become these victims. And ironically, it's Arendt who opens up the possibility with Eichmann in Jerusalem. She highlights she brings up the possibility of the Jews in the concentration camps as being somehow culpable in their own victimization and their own atrocities, and so even she is using this term evil so problematically that
Jewish scholars get upset often with Arendt for this, and I don't know how well it's regarded anymore, but Hitler's willing executioners seems to want to offer, and there's others that
essentialist argument that the Germans were somehow enthusiastic participants because of ideology. 18th and 19th century traditions of anti-Semitism.
Right.
I guess, but what I'm trying to suggest is this. We don't want to say right now, oh, poor Harvey Weinstein, he must have really had a tough childhood. I wonder what happened to him. He's clearly suffers from some clinical disorder that needs to be diagnosed. No, we want to say, what a jerk, what a bad guy, and we might even not hold back. We might say, sounds like an evil dude. Yeah. So that's my sense, is that perhaps it's useful in that regard. I'm not committed to that view. I'm just suggesting it's a possibility. I commit to nothing.
I'll speak as the defender of the indispensability of the notion of evil, and I'll make this point. I think an argument could be made that the argument against the use of evil is based, the conclusion of that argument is we need to dispense with the use of the notion of evil because to use the notion of evil has horribly evil consequences. And so we're stuck in one of those great paradoxes. Your argument against evil is based on the view that there is such a thing as evil that it leads to. And so you haven't gotten rid of it at all. What you're really arguing against is too glib a use of evil, not getting rid of the notion of evil. The tendency to project evil onto others, to get it out of yourself, because no one wishes to think of himself or herself as evil. But even that, again, you're still recognizing the notion of evil. And then if we just go back to something like the notion of original sin, we all know evil's real because we find it in ourselves before we ever do any projecting out. We have found the impulse from when we were young to hit my little brother for no good reason. So, and that's just, I mean, this is what the great theologians, philosophers, many of them, of course, are telling us. It's indispensable because it's real. We know it's real because it's in each and every one of us.
I want to talk about like the follow the leader mentality. You know, the whole I was in my line of duty, so I did these bad things. I'm interested in that. You know, why do those people, you know, become evil? And basically, you know, they wear blinders. You know, you were talking about tradition, anti-Semitism, and stuff like that. And they're led that way through tradition. And maybe that's your reason. But I guess through each of your views that you've expressed, is it comfort? Is it fear? What keeps those blinders on and keeps us looking in that one direction, or keeps those people looking in one direction? I'm probably guilty of it too. But what's the biggest thing there? What makes the followers go forward? Does that make sense?
Going forward and cooperating with whatever harm is being.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a number of things. I think the Milgram experiment shows that there is a certain tendency of human beings to be highly tribally influenced by social pressures of group or of authority figures. But I don't think unfortunately, we can't do that experiment anymore. It's not considered ethical. But I think it's also cultural. Like I haven't done anything with this paper, but as a senior in college, I did a paper where I just counted how many times certain influential German philosophers before the Holocaust used the word duty. And then I tried to compare it. This was a bizarre, I would never do this again, but then I had a lot of time on my hands. And then I tried to count how many times French or other philosophers. And I argued that the German philosophers had a much bigger obsession, and therefore revealed a much bigger obsession with the idea of obedience to authority or duty. And I would stand by that. I think that's true. Like if you look at Kant, I like Kant a lot, but he's obsessed with the idea of duty, right? So I think it's both cultural.
But it may be too complicated. But it's a conception of duty that entails autonomy. So it's a law that one subjects to oneself. So Kant is perhaps the greatest spokesperson or spokesperson against heteronymous forms of duty.
Yeah. But he does argue if a police comes to your door and asks.
Yes, but that's based
that's
based on moral. That's based on purely rational considerations.
Exactly. I mean, it's not an unthinking concept of duty, right? It's not where you comply with what you're told to do no matter what, right? It's a
Perhaps the more interesting thing to say about Kant is that he uses duty as a kind of category or term for getting at what he's trying to say, thereby assuming that his audience will be captivated by this term. So just throwing out an idea that might be able to save this argument.
You could also do micro-familial culture too as influencing it. I think the German culture was very obsessed with the father figure as a kind of somebody who they were looking at. But maybe that's across all cultures in the Western world at that time. But I think if you're too obsessed with authority figures in the micro, in the family, and that's the family structure, you're sort of priming the pump to. I'm interested in our early childhood experiences in the schools too. I think this applies to American culture too. We did some terrible things during World War II. We shouldn't forget that. And there was very little questioning of it, partly because we were also highly influenced. What I'm saying is, this is not an essential human trait, I don't think. I think it's culturally taught by training children to be obedient and from a very early age. And I would
Through
say
patriarchal institutions, perhaps?
yeah, through patriarchal institutions, exactly. School, through all the ISAs, right?
Right, and then, so how can we embed that into particular cultures when that seems to be patriarchy seems to be a common institution since humans began to settle down?
Well, I don't want to totally generalize, but if you go to South Seas Polynesian islanders, they don't have that. idea of obedience to the fathers nearly as much.
So we have a woman in the back who'd like to close it, and then we've got someone over here too. So I think we should. Oh, you know what? It was probably on. It's not very
This
loud.
gentleman has.
Okay, well, on the topic of patriarchy and in the spirit of International Women's Day, I thought maybe we could put a little slice in all the men who've been speaking and asking questions. I'm an artist, so to me aesthetic comes into play a lot. So I guess the question that I had was, is this event evil? Because basically you filled a room full of people by posting signs all around campus that literally had the word evil. So that makes me think, are we attracted to evil? Are we evil in this room? Then I'm hearing a bunch of white men speak, so then I'm like, this is definitely an evil event. That's my personal feeling, but I just was gonna say that to you.
Is that the mic dropping?
Nobody's touching that.
Yeah, no, I was serious about my comments about patriarchy because I think the reason why we come is there's some universal character to the word or the concept of evil. It is, at least in many cultures, but at the same time, I'm always going to argue against any kind of, we could have predicted such a long time ago that these people would become evil and, can perpetrate the Holocaust. And on the other hand, we like to have people come to our talks, so you bet we're going to manipulate the, and none of us had any, we all approved the graphics because they were brilliant. And yes, it's sensationalizing the concept. But at the end of the day, I will do a lot of things in the classroom I'm not proud of. Am I evil? No, but if it gets you to think outside of the box a little bit more deeply and make things more complicated than they are, especially terms like good and evil, where we're bombarded every day with evildoers or fake news, or that we think a little bit more deeply about these words that we throw out very casually. I can go home and sleep well at night.
Now, if anybody's willing to be the hypocrite, you can blame Gabriel for those brilliant graphics. Liz, go ahead. I think unfortunately this has got to be the last question.
No,
Speaking of the patriarchy, there seems to be, I'm not saying it's essential or something like that, and maybe this has to do with some of the stuff that you said about the patriarchy and stuff like that, but almost all of the examples, and if we start to name things off the top of our heads that everyone in the room will agree with is evil, they pretty much all are perpetrated by men.
That's not true.
It's not
universal.
There are counterexamples. That is true.
Unless it's not true.
Well, but I didn't say every single thing. I said all of the examples that people used, and the majority are not everything, but
all the big ones that we think
all the big ones that we think of first,
But to
right?
demonifiy white males is just lazy.
I didn't say white males.
Well, I mean, she did, and then we say that's males.
Didn't involve white males at all.
No, it's not.
Or I don't know about at all, but I mean.
Oh, very few.
Very few, right? But I mean.
Let's let her finish her question.
So there does perhaps seem to be, at least sociologically, historically, whatever, at least for these big events, I'm not saying individual personal type of things like that, but when we do think about these really big ones, they're the paradigm examples are Hitler and stuff like this, right? And so does anyone have any sort of theories about maybe the relationship between sort of some of the theories about patriarchy and how this gets enacted by, or even just in our mind when we think of an evil person, right? I think a lot of people are going to gender like Satan, right, is not a woman, right?
A lot of people think of their mother-in-laws.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean. Yeah, the evil stepmother is a trope. So it's not like
Eve is the
completely, there are counterexamples.
Right, yeah.
But I mean, like, just sort of in general, right, I think that there's, I don't know, there's some kind of gendered thing going on here maybe.
Well, if we're talking about acts of political violence,
Yeah.
then of course, this is just inevitable. I mean, how many female political figures can you name from the 17th century?
Well, but like not just the like Hitler, but also like all of the individual SS officers and
Right.
stuff like that as well,
And
right?
that-
all the people that Amy was talking about. I mean, I'm not an expert in that particular genocide, but I mean, all these neighbors, right? Were they the women neighbors as well?
They were
Yeah.
honestly both.
Both. Okay.
There's in my field of Nazism and fascism, this is an explicitly
It's very
masculine, homophobic movement.
Yeah.
And so much so that Mussolini would not allow unmarried men to be members of the fascists, and women in Germany were not allowed to be, they could vote, but they couldn't be members of the Nazi Party.
Okay.
So there's that. It's interesting. There's a really great book written from German Jewish women's perspectives, and it's very clear that Jewish women in the 1930s almost immediately saw the danger signs, and their husbands reacted very differently. They were concerned with the welfare of their children. They interacted with people on the streets and the stores, and they saw the threat immediately, where men who occupied a different space didn't see that immediate danger. They had a different stake. So it becomes gendered that way in those particular cases. But there's where we haven't talked about is more, I'm getting out of my area of expertise when I make some of these comments, is the issue of rape. And rape on the Eastern Front, almost unheard of on the Western Front in World War II by the Nazis. But rape becomes a symbol of conquest and also revenge between the German army and the Soviet army. And it's interesting with the My Lai massacres, and so it's argued, that they're conquering civilian populations. With the My Lai massacres by Company C, they raped, women as well, even though they don't discuss it in the interviews. That just isn't dealt with at least right now in the historiography. Their women aren't being threatened. That's a typical, that their women aren't being threatened, so they're seeking revenge through acts of sexual violence. And so that, I think, is an issue that really needs to be explored, because this is a very different kind of atrocity that takes place and absolutely deals with patriarchal conceptions of and gendered roles in society.
Yeah, I think you raised a really interesting point, Liz. I think Adam's point is well taken, that especially if we look kind of back in time, we just don't see a lot of women who are necessarily in a position to do the kind of large scale acts that we see men doing. But I was kind of, as you were talking about that, I was kind of thinking ahead to like our own day and age. And I always like to make a distinction between like the institution and the individuals in it, right? And I think to some extent we can characterize a lot of the institutions as patriarchal and sometimes masculinist, even kind of regardless of which individuals are kind of in the roles. And I was kind of thinking even about female heads of state. Even if we look back to the experience of the last century or so, we've seen a reasonable number of women as heads of state, and kind of the track record really varies. I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of women who have been fairly militaristic and as aggressive as their male counterparts, like Margaret Thatcher, right, the Iron Lady, or you know, we can think of a number of instances where, you know, we might have a woman who's head of state of a major power and behaves essentially the same as a man would, maybe even more aggressively in some cases. Or, you know, to go back to the instance of the military, yeah, I was thinking about some of the abuses we saw in the course of the Iraq War, especially like at Abu Ghraib, where Lindy England, yeah, absolutely. You know, where we saw, you know, women essentially doing the same kinds of things that we see men doing. And, you know, I think essentially kind of plugging women into an institution that may be patriarchal, that may be aggressive, that may be homophobic, that may have all these other qualities, doesn't change the nature of the institution. It tends to change the nature of the person, or at least their actions, right? But I mean, I think it's really, yeah, it's a really important point.
So that seems like it's more about like the power than like the gender, right? Yeah, opportunity or power or something.
Yeah, or the frankly the nature of the institution, right? I mean, the institution isn't going to change just because you plug in a few women, right?
One little comment about this. Obviously, the patriarchy gives the power to, has given traditionally the power, and I think power is the key, right? More to men. But if we look at Nazi Germany, Nietzsche's, comes before Nazi Germany, Nietzsche's sister is really complicit in a lot of the things that happen. I mean, I don't think Nietzsche's a anti-Semite at all, but yet once he's mentally ill and she starts controlling, she is an anti-Semite, right? And starts controlling the text. She does some horrible things with it and publishes some things that I don't even know that he wrote. Secondly, Fritz Lang's wife, right? Fritz Lang leaves, is embarrassed by having done Metropolis. He thinks it's an offensive film, and he doesn't want to be caught up in UFA, right? He doesn't want to be in charge of German Nazi filmmaking. He leaves, but his wife is gung ho. She's like one of the great Nazi filmmakers. And Leni Riefenstahl, although she's a more conflicted figure. So, I mean, if we want to look for them, we could find some really morally complicit women. But I think you make a good point that, you know, I guess as women, it'll be interesting to see as women break through the glass ceiling more and more of having power, whether they will behave in ways just like the men have behaved in horrifying ways.
Yeah.
Wow, that's something to look forward to.
Well, that's not the kind of breaking through the glass ceilings we're hoping for.
Yay, gender equity.
Yeah, we need more female.
So I think I know we have lots of hands still that we didn't get to. There's one here, Ved there. It's run longer by half an hour than I anticipated, and I think we should let you guys go. I think we can maybe hang out for a few more minutes. So if you guys are, you know, willing to come and talk to us, we'd be happy to continue the conversation. And thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it.
We're hoping that we can make this a regular thing with different themes. This just happened to be the theme. So if you have theme ideas, you can email.
Yeah, and please sign up outside so we can put you on our Q-File list, so you'll get notification about future events.
Thank you all.